Now, customer experience is often described as the end-to-end experience that a customer has with your organization. And I agree with that definition. But sometimes when we're leaders within our organizations focused on customer experience, we have to take a step back and look at what we're calling hidden CX. These are the things that might be invisible to the customer, but certainly impact their customer experience. So today we're going to dive into a few of these ideas. And as always, we welcome your questions. We welcome your discussion as well. So good to be here, everybody. I'm Jeannie Walters, as always, with another Experience Investigators live Ask Me Anything session. So welcome. We always love to hear where you're from. So let us know where you're joining us from today. As well as, in the United States here, we have a long weekend coming up for the holiday. So if you have that long weekend, how are you going to spend it? What are you doing as we get to a 3-day weekend here in the States? And if you don't have that where you are, let us know what you're doing for the weekend anyway. And then, as always, we are here Fridays, either live or recorded. So be sure that you join us every Friday to get your questions answered about customer experience. So with us, as always, is David Hornreich, our Director of Marketing. David, how are you today?
Hello, I'm very well. We've got a 3-day weekend coming up, which I'm very excited about. It is no longer 110 degrees in Washington State, so
Excellent.
everything's looking up.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I'm very relieved for you because I know that was a miserable time for a lot of people there.
Yeah, it was pretty intense.
Yeah. So do we have people joining us, telling us how they're spending the weekend?
We do. We've got Olatoye joining us again from Nigeria. Great to see you as always. We've got Mark, who is in Paris, who will be barbecuing. Thais is here as well. So we've got a lot of the core here joining us, which I'm very, very happy to see. Should we get into it?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do
All
it.
right.
Well, good to see you, everybody. Glad that you could join us today. And as I mentioned, we're talking about hidden CX today, these parts of the journey that could be not necessarily visible to the customers, but have an impact on their customer experience. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeannie Walters. I am founder and CEO of Experience Investigators. We help leaders really provide meaningful customer experiences that drive business forward. And we do this through trainings, through workshops and keynote speaking, as well as coaching and consulting around customer journey mapping and things like that. We love hearing from you, so please reach out, join us here on LinkedIn, connect with me, follow our YouTube channel, subscribe there for other videos like this, as well as on Instagram and Twitter. Start up a conversation. We love to hear from you. So today, we are talking about what we're calling hidden CX, and this is really what's happening behind the scenes. And in this discussion, instead of talking about the internal behind the scenes, which are things like your employees' training, your employee tools, things like that, we're talking a little bigger. We're talking about things that can disrupt your customer's journey that maybe we don't always think about. And when we think about them, what do we do? Because it's really easy to talk about these things in theory, but when I'm talking to different customer experience leaders, this is the question I get a lot. How are we going to prepare for these things? What happens when we have supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, or even weather events? These are the things that we're talking about that impact the customer experience. And if we're not thinking about them, it's really easy to be caught where all of a sudden there might be a weather event that impacts how customers get their products. How can we address that as customer experience leaders, even though we don't have control over these things? So today we'll be talking about, and my slide decides not to respond. So this is live. Hi, everybody. So we're going to be talking about 3 ways to prepare, and hopefully my slides will catch up here. So when we're talking about really addressing how to do this, we're talking about how to do this in a way that you can prepare, right? And so when we are doing that, we are looking at things like what if customer journey mapping. So when we're looking at what if customer journey mapping, what that means is actually thinking about the what if scenarios that could pop up. And once we do this, how can we really understand the customer's perspective? We're also talking about open and transparent discussion, not just with your customers, but also with your suppliers and your partners moving forward. And then finally, one of the tools I love is service blueprinting. This does help us actually think of, what is happening in our organization that can support these kind of disruptions so that it doesn't disrupt for the customer quite as much as it could. So let's talk about what if customer journey mapping. This is one of my favorite things to do because when you think about what could happen instead of necessarily what will happen, it allows you to really start thinking in a prepared way. So, what would happen if your supply chain was disrupted? What would happen if things were delayed? What would happen if your communications went down? What would happen if your slides didn't work? All of those things you can really look at and decide, okay, how would we handle this? How would that impact the customer and how can we prepare? So sometimes I like to think about this as, think about being a homeowner. There are so many ways that things happen that you can't control. So, with weather, for instance, if we are thinking about it as a homeowner, we might do things like put in a sprinkler system for our grass if we live in a really dry area. We might do things like in my place here in Chicago, we have a battery operated sump pump that kicks in when the electricity goes out or our other sump pump needs the help because if we get a lot of rain, we want to avoid flooding. So that's all because we've thought about those what ifs. When you are looking at your own customer's journey, think about those types of what ifs. And then you can start putting in those preventative measures as well as considering, okay, what if this does happen? Let's go ahead and address it. Let's go ahead and communicate. How would we get that information out to customers? How would we reassure them? How would we let them know about the delay? All of those things become really apparent when you consider the what if scenarios. The other thing to consider here is open and transparent discussion. When we work with suppliers and partners, a lot of times it becomes a very one-way or transactional relationship. But the ones that really do this well, they're partnerships. We partner with our suppliers, we partner with our partners, with our vendors, with the folks that are providing the things that we need to move our business forward. And there is a pattern right now that we're making it more and more difficult for suppliers and vendors to work with large organizations. I would encourage you to look at that journey and think about what are ways that we can reduce the effort for them in working with us. And this is for two reasons here that I'm bringing it up. One is because it's the right thing to do. If we are about reducing effort for our customers, we need to think about reducing effort throughout the ecosystem that supports our customers' journey. But then we also want to do this because we are sometimes working with them in a capacity where they're working with many, many other organizations. If they have a great relationship with us, when the going gets tough, when supply chain does get diminished, or when there are these things that delay things and they have to prioritize who they're working with, if we have that great relationship, they are more likely to prioritize our experience and our customers' experience. And so when we are thinking about our suppliers, our vendors, the folks who, handle logistics, maybe those third-party people and organizations that we rely on, it's really important to think of how can we reduce effort in that partnership and how can we openly talk about these what if scenarios with them. So tell me about what happens if the product gets delayed. Tell me about what happens if your warehouse goes offline. So all of those questions are great to start having before you need to have them. What happens typically is that we wait for those events. We wait for something to happen before we have that conversation. And then everybody is left feeling very unprepared and maybe even felt a little deceived because we haven't had that kind of open dialogue. So I encourage you to think about who are your suppliers and vendors that really impact the customer journey and how can you reach out to them and make sure they understand how important this is and they understand that you want that open and honest dialogue and partnership with them. And then finally, service blueprinting. This is a tool you've heard me talk about before. We have a LinkedIn course all about service blueprinting if you are interested. but we also are really looking for what are we doing inside our organization and what are the processes and systems that we are reliant on, dependent on, in order to deliver that customer journey. Service blueprinting is when we think about the customer journey that the customer experiences and sees and feels, and then we dig down. So it's basically the tip of the iceberg for what the customer is actually experiencing. And then we actually drill down and figure out, what do our employees need? How can we train them? How can we give them the tools they need to succeed? What processes and systems need to be working well in order to deliver this experience? And what are the things that maybe we're not thinking about when we think about that customer's perspective that needs to happen? How can we make sure that everything that the customer doesn't see works according to a plan so that it can deliver on that customer journey, on that customer experience? It's a really powerful way to look at things, and it's a really powerful way to communicate with employees. So I encourage you to think about that. This is an example from that LinkedIn course. This is a very simple version. You can get into a lot more detail if you'd like. But the idea is to really visualize what needs to happen when, and what, how can we make sure that those systems and processes and employees and everything else are working in concert to deliver on the customer experience that we want our customers to have. As you're working on these service blueprints, I would encourage you to think about those what if scenarios. So if you have a service blueprint available today, take a look, go back and think about what are some of the ways that we can move forward with this, with those what if scenarios. What would happen if the email server went down? What would happen if our supplier was delayed? This is a great place to really guide you and figure out what tools you and your employees need so that you can continue to at least set the right expectations with your customers, even if you can't deliver on that ideal experience. If things happen that are out of our control, the one thing we can control is setting those expectations and the way we communicate. And so having those crisis management, those prepared ideas of what to do when things are disrupted can really help you succeed when otherwise it's hard to do so. So wrapping up here, what we recommend, what if customer journey mapping? If you haven't thought about that, look back on the last 18 months that we just had and think about how, many organizations would have benefited from that. Maybe we weren't ready to think about a pandemic, but now we know what can happen. What would happen if some of the regulations changed where you are? What would happen if, travel is getting more and more crowded, flights are getting canceled, things like that? What would happen if you couldn't get people to where you needed to get them? Go through those types of smaller steps to really help you think through these disruptions that could happen to your customer experience. Open and transparent dialogue and discussion with suppliers and partners is absolutely critical. Make sure that you have those solid relationships so that they are willing to tell you when things might go wrong. If they see something coming up that they know is going to disrupt them, you want them to be honest and prepared to talk to you about it and not worry about getting, the phone slammed down on them or something. Wow, do people still use phones like that? I guess we'll find out. And then service blueprinting is just a great tool to really look at your own processes, your own systems, your own employees. How can you better prepare to deliver on the customer experience that your customers deserve? So these three things can really help you think through that hidden part of CX, the part that isn't visible to the customer, but absolutely impacts their experience. So my final question here, are you looking ahead? Do you feel like people in your organization are looking ahead? We've been talking about this quite a bit here on these sessions, as well as just through our blog and other resources, because we're finding that a lot of people talk about the importance of forecasting, the importance of crisis management planning and things like that, but they don't actually take that next step to do it. And so it's really hard to carve out time for this. It's really hard to prioritize. But if you take a moment to really consider what expectations your customers have today, and then take another step back and think, okay, how can we really prepare for them tomorrow? How can we make sure that we are going to be there for them when we know these disruptions happen, when things don't go as seamlessly as we want them to? So if you take that idea of hidden CX and kind of use that lens as you're looking at your own customer experience journeys and how you deal with customers, it can really help guide you on getting better prepared for these things that could happen in the future. So I'd love to hear, what are you doing to prepare for all these disruptions? Have you prepared? It's okay. This is a safe space. You can say that maybe you haven't done anything, because most leaders haven't. And what are your questions? What can we talk about today around hidden CX, or whatever questions you have? So David, how is it looking? Oh, you're muted. Oh,
Oh,
we've gone like a couple weeks, I think.
yeah.
Let
Yeah.
mm.
I was a little distracted because I was trying to plan out how I could quickly get an old school telephone to
Oh,
be talking
nice.
on and then hang
Yeah,
up as I came back.
that would have
And
been sweet, but
that's my official excuse. Let's just pretend that I did that instead of
yes.
being on mute. Uh, let's get to a question from Thais. She says, I struggle to create a service blueprint. I'm going to
Mm,
check out the LinkedIn link after, and I'll put that back up for the
excellent.
LinkedIn Learning Service Blueprinting course. But she asks, do you have any tips on how to create an ecosystem for this?
Mm, love this question. First of all, I would say, we probably don't create it. It's already there. So it's kind of looking at, you've heard me say, look at the customer's real lives. That's kind of the approach we have to take for suppliers and vendors and folks like that too. So what I like to do is kind of start with that customer perspective and then go out from there. So if that's your focus, then if you build that service blueprint, it can really help you understand what processes and things like that have to work on your end. And then let's say one of the things that has to work is that you have to get a shipment of, I don't know, what's a made up metal? Titanium or something from, I'm trying to think of what they used in Black Panther. So you need some sort of, metal to make your project, to make your product. And you know that sometimes those shipments get delayed. Maybe they're coming from areas that aren't as stable. Maybe it's something where the price is very dependent and fluctuating. If you know something like that is a little volatile, I would say zero in on that aspect and then start thinking about, what can we do to either build more relationships so that maybe you have more than one partner for that, or you know what to do when it gets unstable. So it's really looking at, what are the processes and systems and partnerships that maybe aren't as stable as we need them to be, or could have some instability through weather, through all these different things. And then kind of broadening your scope out from that customer's perspective and thinking about, okay, how will we tell the customer that things are delayed? How will we prepare the customer that the cost is going to rise? How will we prepare the customer that our supply chain is totally disrupted and we have to actually limit how much they can purchase with us? This happened during the pandemic, where in the beginning people were, you know, raiding grocery stores and clearing off shelves and things. And so there were all those like toilet paper shortages and things like that. And the stores couldn't get the product fast enough. So they started limiting. But a lot of customers didn't know that until they showed up at the store and there was nothing for them. So thinking through things like that, how can we help reduce the effort for customers throughout the ecosystem? That's what I would say. We're not creating an ecosystem. We're actually just reflecting the ecosystem that already exists. So I hope that makes sense.
I like it. Let's jump to a question that came in from before the session. And this person asks, as somebody who worries about everything, I could make what if journey maps every day. I hear that. Do you have recommendations on how to prioritize what scenarios to prepare for? Do you base it on likelihood of something happening, impact if it did happen, or something else?
Yeah, I love this question. So, like everything else, priorities are hard. This is a hard thing to prioritize. So a couple things come to mind. One is we have a guide, and we actually just wrote about this in our LinkedIn newsletter, if you haven't subscribed to that, about reflection and planning. And that can really help get clear about what we want for our customers and what we want for our customer experience. So if you haven't taken the step to actually define those things, then priorities get really hard to figure out. So I would say if you haven't done that, take a step back and do that. I would also look at things like, what can we most likely control and what can we most likely not control? And what I mean by that is if we spend all of our time thinking about what we can control for the journey, the part that is just about our brand and the interactions, then we're going to miss all this stuff that happens at the macro level and the global level that will impact our customer experience. So I would say look at what are those places that we know we've had trouble with control in the past. That can be these things that we talked about, like right now there's a labor shortage out there. So what does that mean for our organization? What can we do about that? How can we set better expectations? I shared recently, I went to a restaurant with a friend for one of the first times, and they were struggling to keep up because it was a beautiful day. A lot of people had come out to eat, and they have a very small kitchen and they were short staffed. And the first thing they did was set those expectations. They said, there's a 30-minute wait for the kitchen. I'm happy to seat you. We have the room, but we just want you to know. And I thought that was a great little touch that they were giving us the choice as customers. They were basically saying, this is the reality of the situation. This is how we're communicating it. And everybody who walked in was able to get that experience. So then all of a sudden, our expectations were set. We knew we were going to sit there and sip our coffee and enjoy for 30 minutes before we were really able to even put an order in. That was totally fine with us, but it was about that expectation setting. So that's what I would look at specifically. What do you know you can't always control, and how can you set better expectations?
That's great. And so if you would like to download that CX Leaders Reflection and Planning Questionnaire Guide, we've got the link right here, bit.ly/CX questions. I'll also drop that into the chat so you can just click on it. That'll be a little easier in LinkedIn. We've got a question from Narayan, and this is kind of very specific. So Jeannie, maybe you can speak about the more general idea, but they had a specific example where a customer canceled an order due to the pandemic. There was a vendor push, and they ended up with supply that was already produced, but nowhere to send it. Have you run into these sorts of issues before? From a customer experience sort of perspective, do you have any insights on how to handle that situations, or how could we prepare for something like this with what if journey mapping or it potentially happening in the future?
Yeah, this is a tough one because some of this can't always be avoided. Like we can't always predict what's going to happen with customers and with supply. And so sometimes this does happen, especially with custom things. Even things like displays. During the pandemic, a lot of stores had put in these orders for different holiday displays and things like that. And then they kind of pulled the plug on those companies because they weren't getting the foot traffic. They were closed, all of those things. So when those things happen, some of that just is rotten, and we can't always prepare for those types of things. What we can prepare for as businesses is understanding that these things will happen, and understanding, excuse me, that there will be times when this is the cost of doing business, and that's not fair, and it kind of stinks, but we have to be somewhat prepared for at least a few of these things to happen. And there are people who just don't pay their bills, right? And so we have to be prepared for that. We have to be prepared for the vendors who maybe don't deliver what we want. And so we have to pay them, but then go pay somebody else to either fix it or give us what we actually wanted. So we kind of have to put things like this in that category of, yeah, this happens sometimes and it stinks, but it's not really on the customer. We have to have that agreement with the customer, work with them, figure out ways, if we can, to salvage whatever we can. But then some of that we can't really say we're going to be prepared for everything. We can do our best, and we can prepare for the things that, are around those expectations and things like that. But yeah, unfortunately, I wish I had a better answer, but I think that's the reality of the situation.
One more question, and I think this is one that we've gotten a lot. What's the difference between a service blueprint and a process map?
Ooh, good one. Okay. So a process map is typically from the inside out of an organization, and that's where the focus remains. So a process map might say something like, this is how we move a customer through our customer relationship management system. So it's all about that inside out view. When we are talking about a service blueprint, we are starting with that customer perspective on the top. That's really what the focus is. What is the experience we want the customer to have? And what are they actually seeing, feeling, doing, interacting with, all of those things? So we want to know that the customer is interacting with the mobile app. That's the top line. And then what has to happen beneath that in order to make that work? So that's the difference. We really want to flip the perspective. Process maps are necessary. They help teams be productive, but they're always about that inside out perspective. We want that outside in perspective to guide us so that we can make better decisions on the inside of our organization on behalf of that customer's journey. So we do have that LinkedIn. I know you posted the article too. So the article on service blueprinting gets into a little of that as well. So hopefully that will help you as well.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's going to do it for today. I appreciate everybody joining us. And yeah, Jeannie, where can people find you?
Excellent. Well, thanks for being here, everybody. This is the start of a long weekend, so I really appreciate everybody who showed up, and we always love hearing from you from all over the world. So feel free to reach out. As always, you can find a lot of these resources at experienceinvestigators.com. And if you haven't already signed up for Year of CX, go ahead and do that, yearofcx.com, for all of these different tools and downloadables and things like that. We have a few more coming up in the next few weeks, so be sure you join us. And, as you look to your own future, understand we can predict some things, we can not predict others, we can control some things, not control others. But as CX leaders, our job is to keep the customer top of mind and to make sure that we are doing what we can for them. And so I hope this helped you do that today. As always, you are helping me live our mission of creating fewer ruined days for customers. Just by showing up and learning today, you are helping us live our mission. So thank you for that. We're here every Friday. Feel free to join us, subscribe on YouTube, and we hope to see you again. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.